Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to look at 3 more cases of people who ended up in extremely strange and disturbing locations or positions, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what happened to the poor soul in the final story. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. At 50 years old, Stephen was living a rather simple life. An unemployed miner and a father of 2, Stephen lived in Skello, just outside Doncaster in England. In his free time, there was little that he enjoyed more than rabbit hunting with his dog and ferrets. It was something he had been doing for years, so much so that it was a regular part of his routine. When he attended a family get-together on New Year's Eve 2014 and told his relatives he'd be kicking off the first morning of 2015 rabbiting, no one thought much of it. Stephen often went rabbit hunting alone, but he didn't wander into unfamiliar places or take unnecessary risks. He returned to the same areas time and again, and these were places he knew well and had visited countless times before. Because of that familiarity, there was little reason for anyone to feel concerned when he said he was heading out to hunt on New Year's Day. That morning in particular, he planned to stay close to home as his family had arranged a New Year's Day lunch for 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and Stephen didn't want to be late. He expected to spend a few hours hunting and then head back in time to see everyone. After ringing in the new year and getting a good night's sleep, Stephen woke up early on January 1st, 2015. He gathered his ferrets, leashed his dog, and packed the equipment he normally carried. As soon as everything was ready to go, Stephen stepped out of his house and made his way into the woods at the nearby Squirrel Wood Scout Camp in Doncaster. As the morning passed and 1 o'clock came and went without Stephen showing up for lunch, there was no immediate panic. His family assumed he had simply stayed out a bit longer than planned. But as the afternoon wore on and no one heard from him, their assumptions began to fade and concern set in. This wasn't like Stephen. He wasn't someone who disappeared without explanation or ignored commitments. His loved ones tried to get a hold of him after the lunch with no luck, and when no one had been in touch with him by the morning of January 2nd, they called the authorities. Around the exact same time this was happening, a local resident was out for a walk in the area Stephen had been hunting. As the walker moved along the edge of the wooded area, something caught their attention. Lying near a tree were a pair of Wellington boots, a jacket, and 2 bags. Nearby, there was a dead rabbit and a small mound of freshly disturbed soil. Then, even weirder, tied to a nearby tree was a dog that appeared anxious and unsettled. That scene alone was enough to raise concern, but what the walker noticed next was far more horrifying. Protruding from the ground was the lower half of a man's body. A pair of legs and a part of a torso were visible, extending from a narrow hole in the ground, and there was no movement at all. Emergency services were called to the scout camp, and when responders arrived, they went right to work to free the man from the hole. Once he was removed, he was positively identified. It was Stephen, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. A post-mortem examination later determined that Stephen died from asphyxia caused by a lack of oxygen. While the pathologist couldn't establish the exact time of death, it was believed that he had been dead for several hours before he was found. With that information, investigators began reconstructing what they believed happened on New Year's Day. While hunting, Stephen noticed a rabbit ahead of him. He had already caught one that day and he was determined to catch another, but before he could, the rabbit crossed the ground and disappeared into a hole near the edge of the woods. Stephen then followed it to the opening and peered into it. The hole itself was narrow and led downward at an angle. In an effort to reach the rabbit, Stephen got down on his hands and knees and began trying to grab for the animal, but the opening to the hole was too tight. Using a spade to dig, he removed soil from the sides in an attempt to widen the hole enough to reach inside. When he was satisfied that he could get his body deeper into the hole, he set the spade aside and removed his jacket and Wellington boots, likely to give him more freedom of movement. Once that was done, Stephen inserted the upper half of his body into the opening. The hole curved downward at roughly a 45-degree angle, and despite his efforts to make more room for himself, the space tightened further beneath the surface. At some point, Stephen would have realized that he was wedged in place, unable to move forward or pull himself back out. Evidence at the scene suggested that he fought desperately to free himself. Scratch marks and disturbed soil around the opening indicated repeated attempts to push, pull, and shift his body. His position left him with little room to maneuver though, and the confined space restricted his airflow. No one knows exactly how long Stephen remained trapped, but investigators believed he survived for a significant amount of time after becoming stuck. Alone and partially underground, he continued to struggle until exhaustion set in as he slowly suffocated. It's believed he may have spent much of a full day trapped in the hole before succumbing. Sisters Mildred Bowman and Alice Wardle may have been two grandmothers in their 60s, but they were far from old ladies who preferred to pass their time knitting and sipping tea. To them, life was something to be lived, and while they were getting up there in years, they showed no signs of slowing down. They also showed no signs they could ever be separated either. They lived in different houses, but only a mile away from each other in the Lowfell area of Gateshead, England, so they were close not only in bond, but in distance as well. After both women were widowed, that closeness became even more important in their lives as they supported each other through the ups and downs of grief and moving on. Beyond their tight family bond, one of the things they were most passionate about was their shared love of travel. They liked going abroad, and Spain had become their favorite destination over the years. They returned there regularly, often 2 or 3 times a year, to the point where the trips had become tradition. Leading up to the summer of 2005, the two made plans for another trip to Spain. They booked the holiday through a tour company, arranged their flights, and packed their bags as they had so many times before. The sisters then flew to the eastern coast of the country on Saturday, July 30th, and eventually arrived at an apartment that catered to vacationers looking for a simple, all-inclusive stay. The two had rented a studio apartment that they'd share, and the limited space it offered suited them just fine. After all, they'd be spending most of their time outside of the room anyway, so it was really just a place for them to sleep. As an added treat for this particular vacation, Alice's daughter, Allison, and her husband and sons would be joining them, and the two groups had plans to meet up the next day. After arriving at the apartments, Mildred and Ella settled in and decided to rest. The journey had been tiring, and there was no rush to be anywhere in particular, so they recharged their batteries in preparation for the following day. On the morning of the 31st, Mildred and Alice got up early and wasted no time getting themselves outside. According to what was later pieced together, the sisters spent much of the morning milling around the beaches and pool before returning to their apartment, presumably to get ready to meet up with Allison. When that time came and went without the sisters showing up, though, Allison found it strange, but not all that concerning. The sisters were on holiday, enjoying themselves in a place they knew well. Maybe they lost track of time or left the resort and were running late in returning. As the time passed, though, that assumption became harder to hold on to. Allison and her family began looking for them around the apartment complex, checking familiar spots, including the pool area, and expecting to run into them at any moment. That never happened, though, and with no sign of the usually reliable sisters for hours, worry began to creep in. Figuring there was little else she could do, Allison left a note on Mildred and Alice's apartment door, and the family departed the apartment complex. On the morning of August 1st, housekeeping staff made their usual rounds and attempted to access the apartment the sisters were renting. When they found that the door was locked from the inside, no one thought anything of it. Guests regularly declined cleaning, and there was nothing outwardly wrong to suggest that there was an emergency. By this point as well, the resort hadn't been notified by Allison that Mildred and Alice were missing, so the cleaning staff continued on to the next room and the situation went unreported. Days soon passed without any trace of the sisters, despite Allison's best attempts at locating them. She'd stopped by the apartment complex to look for them with no luck. She'd even asked other guests if anyone had seen the two women, but strangely, no one had. The lack of contact eventually became increasingly troubling for the family, and Allison became convinced that something was terribly wrong. Finally, by Thursday, August 4th, Allison pressured the hotel staff to act. She requested that the apartment be opened so someone could check on the sisters. A maintenance technician was then called and quickly discovered that the door was again locked from the inside. There was no response to any of his calls into the room, though, which was extremely odd. The decision was then made to force entry, and the technician drilled the lock so the apartment could be accessed. When he pushed the door open, neither the technician nor the apartment staff with him saw Mildred or Alice. What they did see, however, was that the fold-down bed unit inside the apartment was entirely detached from the wall and lying flat on the floor. It was only after the heavy wooden frame was lifted that the sisters were discovered beneath it. Both Mildred and Alice were dead. The sisters had been lying side by side on the twin beds, which folded down from a wall-mounted storage unit. This type of setup is often referred to as a Murphy bed. As soon as the bodies of these sisters were found, Spanish authorities were notified and they arrived quickly to cordon off the area and begin an investigation. Upon examining the bodies, investigators immediately noticed that neither of the sisters had been dressed for bed, suggesting they'd gone to lie down for a nap at some point rather than sleep for the night. While resting there, it seems the bed structure failed. When lowered correctly, the structure should have rested evenly and transferred weight through its support legs. In this case, that didn't happen. The bed was left partially angled and its legs were not properly deployed, leaving the wall fittings to absorb weight they were never designed to carry. As the weight pulled against the improperly supported structure, the entire unit detached from the wall and fell forward, trapping both women beneath it. Post-mortem examinations concluded that both women died as a result of suffocation caused by sustained compression, with the key word there being sustained. Their estimated time of death placed their final moments at either late Wednesday night or early in the hours of Thursday morning, roughly 12 hours before they were found. The two had been missing since early Sunday afternoon, though, bringing investigators to a startling revelation. Mildred and Alice had been trapped inside the fold-down bed frame for nearly 4 days before they died. Tragically, cuts and bruises on their hands indicated they had attempted in desperation to free themselves. The thick wooden frame and the way it sealed them in prevented any sound from carrying, meaning that any screams for help went unheard. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, attention quickly shifted to the way the fold-down bed had been installed and whether it should have even been considered safe. The tour company launched its own inquiry too, and what that review uncovered raised serious concerns. They found that the mounting hardware securing the unit to the wall was inadequate. Components meant to anchor the structure into the wall were mismatched and unable to safely support the load placed on them once the bed was unfolded. A criminal case was then brought before a court examining whether the resort was responsible for the deaths. It took more than 3 years for the court to rule that the incident was a tragic accident and that the resort was not criminally liable. This decision obviously angered the sisters' families, who believed the outcome failed to reflect the seriousness of the safety failures involved. Civil action was discussed in the aftermath, but no further updates in the case have emerged after 2009. At the resort, at least, changes did follow. At the time of the incident, 24 of the 136 rooms were fitted with similar fold-down beds. After Mildred and Alice's deaths, every one of those beds was removed from the complex. Jamie and Elijah couldn't have been more excited when their plane landed in sunny Cancun, Mexico on the morning of Monday, July 19th, 2021. After months of planning and excitement, their much-anticipated 10th anniversary celebration was finally underway. And in the early going, it was everything they thought it would be and more. The couple dated for about 5 years before tying the knot in the summer of 2011. After their honeymoon, they settled in Arlington, Texas, where Jamie worked in special education, and a few years later, Elijah fulfilled his lifelong dream of becoming a firefighter. The couple eventually had 2 daughters, and while their jobs were both rewarding, they were also very stressful. And coupled with raising a young family, they were definitely ready for a full week of romance and relaxation when they touched down in Cancun for their anniversary after a 4-hour flight. They got to the resort at about 10 a.m., but since their room wasn't ready, the front desk gave them ID bracelets so they could get food and drinks at the bars. They then headed to the pool where they immediately made friends with a number of other guests, some of whom were from Texas just like they were. Over the next few hours, they swam, talked, laughed, and consumed a variety of different beverages. According to friends and family members, Jamie and Elijah weren't big drinkers, but obviously all-inclusive resorts are often a little bit different. And after all, they were celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary. Several hours later at 4 p.m., a staff member informed them that their room was finally ready. A few minutes after that, they took their bags up and got settled in, but before long, they were right back at the pool bar, hanging out with their new friends. They'd been drinking for about 8 hours when they finally got back to the room again to change for dinner at approximately 7 p.m. That night, they had reservations at the resort's Japanese-themed restaurant. After dinner together, they had 1 drink each at the hotel's martini bar before moving to the bar by the lobby for more drinks at about 8:45. And that's where they stayed for the next hour and a half. By 10:15, after a day out in the heat, Jamie was tired and ready to call it a night. Elijah, however, wasn't quite ready. He told her to head up to the room without him. He would just want to have one last drink before the bar closed at 10:30. Back in the room, Jamie showered, crawled into bed, and quickly fell asleep. Now, some sources claim that she slept until 1 a.m., while others put the time closer to 4 a.m. Whatever the case, Elijah wasn't beside her like he should have been when she rolled over and checked the clock. She was still a little groggy from the long day they had, but she was even more worried about Elijah because she knew he was probably in even worse condition, given how he was when they split up several hours earlier. Most alarmingly, though, was that it wasn't like him to stay out so late. Jamie then called the front desk to ask if they knew where Elijah was, but whoever answered the phone said they hadn't seen him. Next, she threw on some clothes and walked and checked nearly every square inch of the hotel. At that point, she thought he might have passed out in a lounge chair by the pool or in the common area by the elevators. But as she went from area to area and didn't find him, she began to panic. Jamie knew that guests were relatively safe when they stayed on the hotel grounds, but she also knew that Mexico could be a dangerous place in the wrong areas. Complicating things was that the hotel staff regularly dealt with intoxicated guests, and so they didn't panic or jump to conclusions every time somebody staying at the hotel disappeared for an hour or two. Jamie was persistent, though, and eventually convinced the staff to call the police and report Elijah missing. She didn't know how long it would take them to respond or whether they would respond at all. By then, all she could do was try to stay calm and hope that he was okay and that he'd eventually show back up no worse for wear. Over the next couple hours, Jamie regularly checked in with the hotel staff to see if they had any news. Then, shortly before 8 a.m., a hotel manager pulled her aside, sat her down, and told her something horrific, bizarre, and absolutely unbelievable. According to the manager, a groundskeeper at a neighboring resort discovered Elijah stuck in a small first-floor bathroom window at about 7:25 a.m. And to be clear, this was not their resort, it was a resort beside the one they were staying at. Jamie requested to see Elijah's body when the initial shock wore off, but they told her she couldn't because of the ongoing investigation. So frustratingly, while they looked into Elijah's death, all she could do was go back to her room, collapse on the floor, and sob uncontrollably. They arrived just one day earlier, and now her life was completely shattered. It wasn't even really clear what the hotel staff meant. What did they mean that Elijah was found in a bathroom window? And what would she tell her kids? How could she possibly go back and just continue on with life after what happened? These unanswered questions were almost too many to deal with. As Jamie grappled with all of this, the investigation continued, and it would be extremely strange. Strangest, though, was the position of Elijah's body. Local detectives noted that his head, arms, and torso were halfway out a window in a bathroom. The bathroom window was about 5 feet off the floor, so because he was halfway out, his legs were dangling a few feet off the ground. The position of the body suggested that he was inside the bathroom and that he tried to get out by crawling headfirst through the open window. With that said, though, they also couldn't rule out the possibility that he was outside the bathroom and died trying to climb in feet first. In either case, though, the detectives apparently found no signs of foul play. Later that morning, Elijah's body was sent to a local morgue where a pathologist determined that he died from mechanical asphyxiation. This occurs when an externally applied force prevents a victim from breathing properly and ultimately leads to death due to a lack of oxygen. Incidentally, another time this can occur is when a caver gets trapped upside down in a narrow passageway and suffocates. It seems that the way Elijah was wedged in the window prevented him from breathing properly. As a result of what they found, police initially told Jamie that Elijah's death was accidental. She wasn't convinced by this, though, and asked to see the security footage taken the morning of his death. She also asked the neighboring resort to see their footage, but they claimed that they didn't have any because their security cameras weren't working. Jamie also claims that she had to pay hundreds of dollars to see photos of Elijah when she went to the police station. And when she did, it only made things more confusing. She was apparently surprised that his face appeared to be covered in moist dirt as if someone had dragged him across the ground shortly before he was found. And that wasn't all. At different times, she heard different things about Elijah's death certificate. A detective allegedly told her that Elijah's death would be listed as a murder without suspect on the death certificate. Jamie was confused by the detective's comment because the police already told her that his death was an accident. Needless to say, this abrupt 180 reinforced three things she already suspected. First was that in her eyes, there was far more to the story than met the eye. Second, that the police were either incompetent or simply didn't care. And finally, that it would be up to her and her family to figure out what happened to her husband that morning. Elijah's body was eventually transferred to a funeral home where the director washed it and dressed it in presentable clothes. Shortly after that, Jamie's mother and stepfather David arrived in Cancun, and after that, they all went to the morgue together. Once they all said goodbye, Jamie and David got down to the equally important task of photographing every inch of Elijah's body. Of course, this required manual manipulation, which Jamie later described as awful. Even so, it was absolutely necessary because they were convinced that his wounds might be able to shed some light on what happened to him. As it would turn out, Elijah was covered in scrapes, gashes, bruises, and abrasions of various shapes and sizes. He could have caused some of the injuries himself while trying to get out of the window in which he was trapped, but on the other hand, some of the wounds didn't seem to fit the accidental death narrative. Elijah had big bruises on the inside of each of his thighs and another on his stomach that were roughly the size and shape of a shoe or boot. And based on the location of the injuries, it appeared as though an attacker or a group of attackers may have stomped him as he rolled around the ground trying to avoid blows. They also found 4 circular bruises on Elijah's back and right shoulder that could have been caused by someone kneeling on him. They thought this might have been an attempt to prevent him from getting back on his feet during an altercation. And last, they found a number of suspicious cylindrical bruises on his back that appeared to have been caused by strikes from a weapon. Obviously, Jamie and David weren't detectives, but what they saw that day led them to believe that Elijah may have met with foul play. At that point, they knew they had to get out of Mexico as soon as possible. They were concerned that the authorities were worried that something like this would negatively affect Cancun's tourist industry, and as a result, they weren't investigating properly. Worse yet, they claimed they experienced so much overt hostility from the police and the hotel staff that they actually feared for their lives. However, this led to a new problem. They weren't about to leave without Elijah's body. They wanted to bring him back to the US and have his body re-examined. This was then further complicated when they learned that in order to transport a body, it would need to be embalmed, making it difficult to be re-examined anyway. They would end up staying an extra week trying to figure out what to do before eventually deciding to respect Elijah's wishes and had him cremated in Mexico. In the aftermath, Mexican authorities never charged anyone with any crime related to 35-year-old Elijah's death. Jamie and the girls got on with their lives about as well as could be expected under the circumstances, but that wasn't the end of the story. The following year, she filed a wrongful death suit against the owner and the management company at the resort. The companies weren't headquartered in the United States, but apparently that didn't matter since Jamie's attorneys proved they actively marketed vacations to Texas residents. The hotel's lawyers argue that the staff couldn't have foreseen and prevented such a bizarre scenario. They also called a pathologist who testified that Elijah's wounds could have been caused by self-induced asphyxia and that alcohol almost certainly played a role in his death. They also played surveillance footage from the resort that showed Elijah stumbling past the elevators on the ground floor. In the footage, he looked confused and disheveled and apparently couldn't figure out what buttons to push to take him to his room. After that, he wandered away toward the neighboring hotel and eventually disappeared in a dark area not covered by security cameras. In the summer of 2025, a month shy of the 4-year anniversary of Elijah's death, the jury returned with a whopping $31 million verdict against the hotel owner and management company. Along with the ruling, the jury determined that 65% of the responsibility fell on the operator, 25% on the owner, and the remaining 10% on Elijah himself. So with all of this said, there are obviously some important unanswered questions. The main question is whether or not foul play was involved, at least from what is known. The supposed marks on his body and the bruising and otherwise, if they really came from what the family suspect, are incredibly troubling. However, at the same time, since these weren't examined directly on the body by a pathologist or investigator, it makes it hard to determine if their assessment is accurate. Maybe they really were accidentally self-inflicted as he stumbled around in the state he was in. Maybe he really did simply climb that window, get stuck, and then pass away due to lack of oxygen. So, what do you think happened? If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.